I'm here to talk about climate risk and opportunity. So I got interested in this whole issue of climate risk back when I was working at an organization that had a board member named Tom Steyer, who at the time was a hedge fund manager at Farallon Capital. And he had come back from he used to get invited to these dinners at the Treasury, and he came back from a dinner at the Department of Treasury in DC. And it was a whole dinner with the secretary. I think it was Jack Lew at the time, somebody I have not yet whispered to, but I'm working on it. He came back from the dinner and he said, the whole dinner was about them talking about economic trends and what will affect our economy. And we talked about inflation, and we talked about terrorism, and we talked about cyber terrorism and global pressures. And at the end of dessert, Tom sort of raises his hand and says, guys, climate change? What about climate change? And he describes it as they all sort of patted him on the head and said, oh, that's a nice little issue that you care about. We're here to talk about the economy. So he came back, and he and I started a series of conversations about how to make climate change into an economic discussion, how to change the debate in the US for business leaders and investors in particular, and the kind of people who go to Treasury dinners, and how to really change the debate to be about climate as an economic risk and an economic opportunity. And so we started something called the Risky Business Project out of that conversation, which involved a number of people, including, you can see up there, Mike Bloomberg, Tom Steyer, Hank Paulson, who I think of as a former Treasury Secretary, but you think of as dad of owner of the Timbers, right? But these guys and a number of other former cabinet members and CEOs. And the goal of this was really to say, what kind of risks are we facing, first of all, if we do nothing on climate change, and then what kind of risks are we facing if we don't act to come to the solution? So we did a risk framework for the Risky Business Project, because that, for any of you who've been in business or worked in an investment firm, this is how people think. You have a risk committee that puts together an analysis of what are the big risks facing the economy, facing your business, facing your assets, facing your supply chain. And risk turns out to be not only a good way to talk about this with a lot of folks in business because it's familiar, but it also turns out to be a good way to talk about it because risk allows you to deal with changing conditions. And one of the things about climate change is we know every day that we don't do anything, more emissions go into the atmosphere, and it actually changes the risk profile. So what is today a 1 in 100 event or a tail risk becomes tomorrow 1 in 20 becomes likely. The risk approach allows you to talk about ranges, which turns out to be not only something that business understands, but also just a better way to talk about this issue. So this was after we worked on this issue, although Mike Bloomberg was involved in this as well. And I put this up just because talking about risk in the investment community and talking about it here and talking about with policy really means two different things. And I'm going to talk a little bit about both. One of those is physical risk. What happens if we do nothing to our actual physical, the state of the union? So what happens in terms of physical risk from heat, sea level rise, storm surge, wildfires, et cetera? Another big category of risk, and it's one that's really relevant to this policy debate up here, is the transition risk issue. What happens if you fail to transition? What are the risks to our economy if we don't pay attention to where the market is going, and if we don't pay attention to where the globe is going and we miss the boat? What kind of risk does that entail to the economy? Both of these are critical risks for the economics and for the business sector and for investors, and they're both incredibly important here in Oregon. So the Risky Business Project focused in on physical risk mostly, and we talked about what happens if we stay on our current path. Now, this was back in 2014. This was, the red line was the path we were on. We've actually kind of come down a little bit from that, and then we're starting to go up again, if you've looked at the news coming out about our emissions pathway. But essentially, when you model risk, right, when you're like, what does this mean for our economy? You do the worst case. You do the business as usual. You don't do where might we be if we do 75 things. You do where are we heading today? And so the question for us was, what happens if we're on the red line, and what happens, and how do we try to get off the red line? One of the kind of aha moments for me in this project, and it's something I think is incredibly important here, I've heard a couple of times from some of you at out drinking wine, or some other times I've been up here, why should we act? We're only X% of the global emission problem, right? We're only, what is it, 0.4, Oregon, something? California is only 2%, just to give you context. But But the fact is that though we tend to talk about climate change as this lofty global problem where we're like, oh, we're such a small impact, what can we do? All we can do is stew and worry. In fact, climate impacts are incredibly local. And the work we did on risky business, which was very, very granular, we did this analysis of physical risk at the county level, which had never been done before. And I could talk for hours about big data and how we were able to do it, but it was very granular. And what you realize is that different places have different impacts. This happens to be a heat map, right, of the US through the century. So you see the US is not one thing. The US is many different types of places when it turns out when you look at heat. But this is also true for sea level rise, not the same on the East Coast and the West Coast. It's true for storms and storm surge and inundation, and it's true for other impacts. So different places also react differently to these impacts and have opportunities that are very, very local. So talking about climate change, as someone said on the project when we were doing it, talking about climate change in terms of US or global averages is like saying, well, my head's in the refrigerator, but my feet are in the oven, so I'm good. I'm average, right? Not really true, right? When you start to dig in. So this is the risky business map in the Northwest, and you would look at this and you would say, this is the heat map. That looks okay. I mean, go back to that other one, and it's all red, and the Northwest is all green. And on first look, it seems to be much less affected. You have heat that's not as extreme as some other parts of the country. Agriculture yields, we did look at the agriculture sector, and you look up in the Northwest, and you've actually got increased ag yields on some commodity crops, which sounds great. We see this now actually with some of the specialty crops in California moving north to take advantage of these trends. You see, well, labor productivity is kind of bad everywhere. This was interesting. One of the big impacts we looked at was the effect of heat on labor productivity, and it turns out that sort of the whole country has that impact at various levels. But on energy, this is interesting. On energy, you look at this and you think, oh, the Northwest is doing okay. We have, why do you have this in most of the country? It gets hotter. Your central power plants get less efficient, your transmission gets less efficient, you also have a lot more people with air conditioning, and all of a sudden your costs go way up. In the Northwest, you happen to have this nice, clean, consistent energy source for a large part of the energy, and so it looks pretty good up here. But going back to all impacts are local, zeroing in on the western states, we find, of course, you already know this, a big drought impact leading to increased wildfire risks across the entire West. We all have seen this. We've all experienced this. We all know this viscerally. And of course, ocean acidification, so pH going up off of the coast here. So these are very specific local risks. And they're a good reminder of the fact that you have to look very locally to figure out what the physical risks are. But I don't want to lose track of some of the story is not all bad up here, and that's actually important when we're thinking about what opportunities these two states have. So those are the physical risks, but what about the risk? Well, let me go back and say this region is not self-contained, right? So this is Boeing's supply chain for the 787. Boeing, it turns out, does not make everything here in the Pacific Northwest, where the risks are not that great, and doesn't buy everything from here in the Pacific Northwest, and is relying, in fact, on a number of places in the Southeast, which was one of those big red places in the earlier map. Amazon does a lot in Texas, it turns out, which was a very red place, a red state in more ways than one in that earlier map that I showed you. So the Pacific Northwest economy is not self-contained. These industries have national and global supply chains. They will be affected by the trends, the physical trends we talked about, but we can go beyond physical trends. These are the physical risks, but what about the risks? There's the owner of the dad of the owner of the timbers there, making a little statement. What about the risks of not transitioning to a low carbon economy? What about the transition risk? What about the opportunities, put another way, for this region as the world embarks on this transition? So as with climate risk, climate solutions are inherently local. How a region decides to embark on this journey and to tap into the global market of decarbonization depends on geography, economy, and frankly, it depends on culture. It depends on, it's like economic development 101. What assets do you have now, and how do you build on those assets to be part of this future? So just a little primer on decarbonization. You know, what is the answer to the climate risks we just talked about? The way to get off the red line is to decarbonize. Carbon led to the red line. We get off the red line by decarbonizing. The way to do that is essentially fuel switching. We talked about this earlier, to electric sources, decarbonization, and energy efficiency. So I like to simplify this because I like to simplify everything. How many in here have read The Omnivore's Dilemma? Good Michael Pollan fans out there? So I like to break this down to use electricity, not too much, mostly renewables. You can remember that, right? If I were really good, I would add remove carbon to this list, right? But it kind of ruins the cadence, but it is actually important. So that sounds easy, right? I mean, you know, I broke it down to 3 things. It sounds easy. But it actually takes policy change and it takes operational change in the business sector. One thing it requires is upfront investment. It requires us to spend money to invest in capital equipment that moves us from one set of inputs to another set. One of our, Greg Page, former CEO of Cargill, who was part of Risky Business, calls this substituting capital for fuel. Basically, today, a lot of places spend money on capital equipment and then they continue spending on fuel for the life of a project. You keep buying coal, you keep buying gas, you keep buying oil. Decarbonizing means you spend money up front on capital equipment, but then you don't spend anything after you do the first investment. And by about 2030, the savings line eclipses the investment line. So that's cool. That allows, doing that kind of a shift allows for major opportunities in people's portfolios. So what can you invest in? You know, think about history, think about today. We used to invest in horses, and we invest today in combustion engines. We used to invest in combustion engines, now we're investing in electric drivetrains. We used to invest in coal, now we're investing in gas and a huge amount of renewables. We used to invest in brakes and repair trucks, and now we're investing in variable speed drives. There's all kinds of opportunities for this investment. One of the most important things, I think, from a business perspective about how to do this, and frankly, from a government spending perspective, is you don't do it all at once. You do it when you're already buying things. So I don't know about you guys, I don't replace things very often because I'm a Midwesterner and we save things for as long as humanly possible and fix them with duct tape and bungee cords, but when we do replace things, we have an opportunity to do it well. So I was driving, I am going to admit this to this room, a 1994 Volvo station wagon until very recently, belonging to my husband's late father, and it died on the road in Auburn, California. So we replaced it with a Chevy Bolt. Great example, right? It's capital stock turnover moment. We had a moment where something died. We had an option of how to replace it. We had the option, and we took that option. That is true all over the place, right? You replace your hot water heater with something super efficient. You replace your manufacturing plant with a new, more efficient version, or with something else. You replace a piece of your supply chain because it's at risk. You move it or you replace it. So these moments of capital stock turnover actually create the opportunity for us to decarbonize on schedules that businesses and governments are already on. It does not, as Hank Paulson says, take an energy miracle. It takes good decision making every day, thinking about the future, incorporating those risks into decisions. It's incredibly important. So do it, everybody. So I think that, the important thing is it's not something that business or investors or governments have to stick their necks out to do. From a business language perspective, you don't have Oregon does not have a first mover problem here. This is the kind of thing that's already happening. The transition to low carbon efficient materials and operations is already happening. The market is moving now. This is a chart from the Rhodium Group, who did all the risky business modeling, on what has happened to coal in the last 10 years. This is a fast transition. I remember when we were doing, and Jeremy and I were back working at the Apollo Alliance, our entire point of arguing for renewables was domestic production. We were like, we must get off imported energy. Look at what's happened since that. Look what's happened to coal because of gas and because of renewables, and because of global markets changing their behavior on the carbon emission of different energy sources. This is where the market is going. This is an opportunity wasted if not taken advantage of. Look what's happening to carbon markets. 40 countries, 20 jurisdictions are pricing carbon around the country. The market is moving. This is where the world is going. Not taking advantage of this is missing an opportunity and courting economic risk. China just decided not to sell new electric vehicles after 2019. China already has 10 of the largest EV manufacturers in the world because of these policies, because of the growth of its market, because it's making these decisions. That's not just China. The UK and France, India, other countries have made similar commitments. The market is moving in this direction. So what role can Oregon play? What role can Washington play? There are all kinds of opportunities here. This goes back again to all solutions are local. What worked in California in terms of building markets there is not the same as here. What works in China is not the same. This is a very particular market with very particular opportunities. And I would argue particularly good opportunities to take advantage of this growing global market. Up there in the corner is this is my favorite picture. That is a cross-laminated timber house designed to fit in a parking space. Right? How cool is that, right? It's got a greenhouse at the top. It's got a workspace. It's the coolest thing ever. Cross-laminated timber is a growth market across the world. This is something that the Pacific markets are investing in. This is something that makes places more resilient. These are more movable than steel construction. In places like Oregon and Washington with seismic activity, they're safer. With the timber markets you already have, with the skill sets you already have, and with the access to the Pacific markets you already have, it is an obvious opportunity for this region. Up in the upper corner there, carbon sequestration. One of the things you see if you're at the Paris talks or Bonn right now is that there's all these models about how do we get to 80% by 2050. There's always this wedge that people don't talk about, right? People are like, oh, renewables, and we electrify, and then we do efficiency, and then there's this whole other wedge, which is called negative emissions. And that's the even with all that, we got to get stuff out of the atmosphere because we got too much carbon, and we got to pull it out. What's the age-old demonstrated low-hanging fruit technology to pull carbon out of the atmosphere? Trees. Right? Right? What do Oregon and Washington have a lot of? Trees. Also agricultural practices that actually incentivize getting carbon out of the atmosphere. Obviously, hydro is a huge advantage up here, and there's just an act that was passed in California, and I just heard that Washington's introducing a similar bill called the Buy Clean Act, just passed in California. What that requires is that procurement of major products in California, like building supplies, be done with a life cycle carbon analysis. What does that mean? It means when we, in California, big market, very near here, buy supplies as a state, we look at the carbon life cycle of those products, which means we look at where they were manufactured. That means we will buy them from places with clean power, powering its manufacturing. Who is in a great position to deal with that? You guys, right? So the idea of using your natural advantages on the energy side to actually power some of these new industries in places like California, and I am saying here, I am betting here that Buy Clean is the kind of bill that's going to be like the RPS. It's going to be everywhere. People will pick this up. It's an exciting new policy. You have opportunities there. Obviously, that at the bottom is a solar array here in Oregon. And then there's an industrial efficiency picture down there too, another huge opportunity for the state. In the middle there, I just have to put in a plug for the American Jobs Project, which I'm on the board of, I admit. But they have done some great analysis. They did Washington, they're doing Oregon now, of what the state's assets are and what the best growth opportunities are, given the workforce and given the industries in the state. They did a whole paper on grid modernization in Washington, and it's really worth looking at. These are job opportunities, not just in Seattle, but across the state of Washington, and they're good, high-quality jobs, and they're great for people looking at sort of middle-skill job opportunities. So there's all kinds of things here. The combination of the natural advantages I talked about earlier of not having some of those huge climate risks facing other parts of the country that have become beacons of manufacturing because of low labor costs, that's not going to be the thing that drives manufacturing in the new era. Being in a place that's low risk on the physical side but has this incredible access to markets, not taking advantage of that now would be a huge strategic mistake. So are we going to lead? Or are we going to left behind? This is, of course, a picture of the Timbers. Sadly, I wanted to do a picture of them in the playoffs, and I'm very sad that they didn't Make it, but they're still awesome, and they're still leaders, and we still love them. So are we going to lead, or are we going to be left behind? Leadership means a couple things. Leadership doesn't just come, it means policy and political will. It means policy like internalizing the cost of carbon pollution through putting a price on carbon, which we are hoping Oregon will do this year. It means not subsidizing risky activity. It means actually streamlining investment across training and education, so you're building the workforce of the future as well as the industries of the future, and it means helping those negatively affected, and that is those negatively affected because they're in impacted communities, but also it does mean looking at high carbon industries that are essential to your state and figuring out how to deal with that and to ease the transition through efficiency and other opportunities. Leadership also means operational change, and I mean this for all of you in the room individually, the boards you're on, the businesses you run, all of the places where you have influence. You need to start thinking about these risks and opportunities in everything you do. We need to mainstream climate risk. And that means putting an internal price on carbon if you run a company, which Microsoft, of course, has done. This means setting a reduction goal and having an action plan and publicly disclosing how you're meeting it. Until we get public disclosure, we're not going to know how our companies are actually analyzing and evaluating risk. And it means pushing your policymakers and helping your policymakers to make the right kind of policy choices that we need to make. This is Greg Page. The changing climate will present new risks and new opportunities as we face the very complex task of producing enough food, feed, and fuel for a world on its way to 9 billion increasingly prosperous people. This is a global movement. And we have an opportunity here to not only be part of it, but to lead it. So let's do it. Thank you.